The tragic case of Lorrie Anne Smith shocked the quiet Virginia community in 1997 when the beloved mother of two was found dead in her own home. What began as a suspicious death investigation quickly unraveled into a heartbreaking story of betrayal, domestic tension, and violence. Lorrie's seemingly ordinary life hid the fractures of a turbulent relationship that ultimately led to her tragic end. As detectives pieced together the puzzle, the investigation pointed to someone she knew, raising unsettling questions about the dangers that can exist within close circles. This is the story of Lorrie Anne Smith, a sobering reminder of the hidden risks in domestic situations and the importance of recognizing the warning signs.
Lorrie Anne Smith was a 34-year-old mother of two, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Virginia. She was known for her warm personality, dedication to her children, and active involvement in the local community. Friends and family described her as a caring individual who always prioritized the well-being of her loved ones. On the morning of July 22, 1997, everything changed. Lorrie's lifeless body was discovered in her home by a neighbor who had grown concerned after not hearing from her. The unsettling discovery sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, as violent crime was rare in the area. Police arrived at the scene to find no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Lorrie may have known her attacker. This detail led investigators to believe the crime was personal, rather than random. Her body was found in the living room, and initial assessments suggested she had been strangled. Lorrie's children were not at home during the incident, raising further questions about the timing of the attack. Investigators determined that the children had been staying with relatives the night before, which might have been premeditated by the suspect. Autopsy reports later confirmed that Lorrie had died of asphyxiation, with additional bruising that indicated a struggle had taken place. There were also signs that the perpetrator had attempted to stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. However, inconsistencies in the layout of the house raised red flags for detectives. Interviews with neighbors and close friends revealed that Lorrie had expressed concerns about someone following her in the weeks leading up to her death. She had confided in a friend that she felt uneasy, but did not elaborate on any specific threats. This revelation deepened the mystery and expanded the suspect pool. Detectives began focusing on those closest to Lorrie, including her estranged husband, with whom she was in the process of divorcing. Their relationship had been strained, and court documents showed a history of domestic disputes. Investigators questioned whether personal tensions had escalated to violence. The estranged husband was cooperative but maintained his innocence, providing an alibi for the night in question. However, inconsistencies in his statements and his knowledge of the crime scene details made him a person of interest. Surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras showed his vehicle near Lorrie's house on the evening before the murder. Friends and family were interviewed extensively to gather insight into Lorrie's recent interactions and conflicts. The investigation revealed that Lorrie had been dating someone new, sparking tensions within her family dynamic. Detectives explored the possibility that jealousy or revenge could have played a role in her death. As the investigation progressed, detectives focused on forensic evidence found at the scene. Partial fingerprints on a glass table near Lorrie's body, combined with hair fibers, pointed toward someone known to the family. DNA analysis eventually narrowed the suspect list to one individual: Lorrie's estranged husband.
At this point in the investigation, detectives had gathered key forensic evidence but lacked a suspect. The case grew cold, leaving Lorrie Anne Smith's family desperate for answers. Years passed without significant progress, and despite ongoing efforts, no one was held accountable for her murder. It wasn't until 2018, over 2 decades later, that DNA technology and genetic genealogy reopened the case. The breakthrough led investigators to Jerry Lee Sr., a local man and former corrections officer. His arrest shocked the community, raising new questions about how someone so close could evade suspicion for so long. Now, with the case reignited, the focus shifted to how this crucial piece of evidence would lead to long-awaited justice for Lorrie and her family.
The investigation into the murder of Lorrie Anne Smith began with few leads and mounting pressure from the community to find answers. Detectives combed through the crime scene, meticulously gathering evidence. Initial assessments suggested that the perpetrator had knowledge of the area, and possibly even the victim herself. However, with no immediate suspects, the case grew cold. For years, Lorrie's family lived with unanswered questions and the lingering grief of losing her so suddenly. Despite their persistence in seeking justice, leads dwindled, and the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. The breakthrough would not come until 2 decades later, when advancements in forensic science provided investigators with a powerful new tool: genetic genealogy. In 2018, using DNA extracted from evidence left at the crime scene, investigators submitted the genetic profile to a public genealogy database. This method, which had recently gained national attention for solving high-profile cold cases, allowed authorities to trace family connections to the suspect. After careful analysis, the DNA results pointed to a local man named Jerry Lee Sr., a former corrections officer who had lived less than a mile from Lorrie's home at the time of her murder. The revelation shocked the community. Jerry Lee had no prior criminal record that would have raised suspicion, and his background in law enforcement only deepened the unsettling nature of the discovery. His proximity to the scene and his familiarity with the area added weight to the DNA evidence, which ultimately led to his arrest. Jerry Lee was charged with murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Prosecutors argued that the evidence, combined with the unique familial DNA match, left little doubt about his guilt. During his trial, the prosecution highlighted the meticulous nature of the investigation and how advances in forensic technology had finally brought clarity to a case long thought unsolvable. Lorrie's family, who had waited more than 20 years for answers, sat in the courtroom as the painful details of the crime were revisited. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Jerry Lee pleaded guilty in 2023. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in prison, with the possibility of parole. While the sentencing brought a sense of closure to the family, it also underscored the importance of perseverance in seeking justice. Lorrie's case became a beacon of hope for families of other cold case victims, demonstrating how advancements in science and unwavering determination could bring long-awaited justice. Her memory lives on, not only through her family but also through the lessons learned from her case. Though justice was delayed, the resolution of Lorrie Anne Smith's murder reaffirmed the relentless pursuit of truth, ensuring that those who commit heinous crimes cannot escape accountability forever.
All right, so we're doing a deep dive today on the tragic death of Lorrie Anne Smith.
Oh, yeah.
You know, from a quiet Virginia suburb, a 34-year-old mother of 2.
Right.
Seemed like she was living a pretty ordinary life, but
Yeah.
on July 22nd, 1997, that all changed.
Yeah, it really,
So let's sort of unpack what happened here
it's,
and see if we can piece together this puzzle.
you know, one of the things that really gets me with this is how quickly it all went down.
Right.
And you go from this sense of normalcy to
Yeah.
just this brutal death,
Yeah.
you know, and just makes you wonder how something so
Horrible.
awful could happen
Yeah.
in such a, you know, seemingly normal place.
Yeah, and the crime scene itself
Right.
is very strange, right?
Yeah.
Lorrie's body was found by a neighbor in the living room.
Mm.
There was no sign of forced entry.
Right.
So what does that tell us?
Well, I mean, right away that tells us that it wasn't random.
Right.
Yeah, this was someone that either knew Lorrie or, felt comfortable enough to
be there.
be there.
Right.
And then on top of that, they try and make it look like a robbery.
Right.
Which again kind of points to this idea of premeditation.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like they were trying to cover their tracks.
And then the detail about the kids.
Oh,
the kids being away with relatives.
Yeah.
It just seems
It's a big one.
way too convenient.
Well, it makes you think, right? Like,
Yeah.
was this planned?
Yeah.
Did they know that the kids were going to be gone?
Right.
And if so, that just adds to the
It does.
premeditation, the
Yeah.
planning.
Yeah. It's not a crime of passion. It
Right.
seems very calculated.
Exactly.
So we start to learn more about Lorrie.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that comes up is that she had actually told a friend that she felt like she was being followed.
Yeah, that's always kind of sends a shiver down your spine, right?
Yeah.
She might have had a feeling that something was wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, that detail, it really kind of raises the stakes.
For sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it also makes you think, well, were there any potential stalkers
Right.
or people that might have wanted to harm her?
So naturally, the investigation focuses on the people closest to Lorrie.
Of course.
And one of those people is her estranged husband, Mark Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And we see from court documents that their relationship wasn't exactly
Yeah, they had some problems.
peachy keen.
Yeah, a lot of tension.
Yeah.
A history of domestic disputes.
Right.
Document.
Yes.
It's all right there in the court documents.
So Mark initially says that he's innocent and even offers an alibi.
Mm-hmm.
But there were some inconsistencies in his statements that just didn't seem to add up.
Yeah, it's the little things, right?
Yeah.
Like details about the crime scene that he shouldn't have known.
Right.
And it just kind of makes you wonder, why wouldn't he just be upfront?
Right.
If he was innocent, why not just...
Why all the fabrication?
Yeah, why all this,
Right.
try and control the narrative?
It does seem like there's something he's hiding, right?
Right. And that's what's so interesting about those little inconsistencies.
Yeah.
They just plant that seed of doubt,
Mm-hmm.
and you start to think, well,
Yeah.
is there something more here?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
especially in this case,
Yeah.
it directly contradicts his
alibi.
alibi.
Right, yeah. So it really raises questions
Well-
about, where he was and what he was doing.
Okay, and there's the surveillance footage,
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
which puts his vehicle near Lorrie's house that night.
Yeah. I mean, what are the chances?
Right.
It really seems to put him
Right at the scene.
right there.
Yeah. So
At the very least, he was in the area
he was in the area.
at the time.
Yeah.
So you have to wonder,
Right.
what was he doing there? Okay, so then we also find out that Lorrie was seeing someone new.
Right. New relationship.
Yeah, and that couldn't have sat well.
Well, yeah. I mean, those are powerful emotions.
Right.
Jealousy and revenge,
Yeah.
And in a situation where the relationship's already strained, like it was between Lorrie and Mark,
Yeah.
I mean, things can really escalate.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Right. And then we have the forensic evidence,
Yes.
Right.
The smoking gun.
which always seems to be a game changer in these cases.
Always.
We've got partial fingerprints, hair fibers,
Yeah.
and all this is pointing to someone Lorrie knew.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the walls are closing in at this point.
Absolutely. And it's about to get even tighter because the DNA analysis comes back and it's a match for Mark Smith.
Yeah.
I mean,
Are you?
that's pretty damning.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just circumstantial anymore.
Right.
This puts him right there
Right at the scene.
at the scene. But we also know that he admits to being at her house that night,
Right.
but he claims it was a peaceful visit.
But he says he just wanted to talk.
So
But
how do we reconcile that with
it doesn't really add up, does it?
all the other evidence?
No, you got the DNA, you got the signs of a struggle,
Yeah.
you got the attempted staging.
Right.
So, if he was there,
Right.
what really happened?
Yeah. So we have his version of events, and then we have all this evidence pointing to something completely different.
Right. And this is where the investigation really starts to heat up.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. This is where things get interesting.
The focus shifts from was he there to what happened while he was there.
Okay. So the investigation's moving forward.
Wow.
We have the suspect with a shaky alibi,
Mm-hmm.
evidence placing him at the scene,
Right.
and the possibility of jealousy as a motive.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Well, now we got to look at how the prosecution builds their case.
Right.
How the defense responds, and then ultimately how the jury
Right.
makes sense of all of it.
Okay, so we're about to see this play out in the courtroom.
Exactly. This is where we move from the investigation to the legal battle.
This is where it gets really fascinating.
Yeah.
So stick with us as we unpack the trial and the verdict.
Buckle up.
In the case of Lorrie Anne Smith.
It's going to be a wild ride. Okay, so we're moving into the trial phase now.
Right.
And the prosecution, their job is to present a really strong case, right? To convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Mark did it, that he's guilty of Lorrie's murder.
And it sounds like they have a pretty compelling case, right?
Yeah, they do.
We've got the forensic evidence, the inconsistencies with his alibi, and of course the motive,
Yeah, the jealousy angle.
Yeah, the jealousy. It's all there.
Right, so how does the defense try to fight this?
Well, their job is to, poke holes in that story.
Yeah.
Raise some doubts.
Right.
Create some alternative explanations for the evidence.
Right.
And see if they can convince the jury that maybe Mark isn't the guy. Okay, so how do they do that? I mean, it seems like a pretty uphill battle.
Yeah, it is. But one of their main arguments is that the DNA evidence, while it puts Mark at the scene, it doesn't necessarily mean that he killed her.
Okay.
Right, because his DNA could have been there from other times that he was there.
Right.
Especially if he was there earlier that evening, like he claims.
It makes you think about the limitations of DNA evidence, right? So, it can tell you someone was there,
right? But
it can't always tell you when or what they were doing.
Right, and that's what the defense was trying to do.
Yeah.
Exploit that ambiguity. And they also suggested that, maybe the prosecution was too focused on Mark.
Right.
Maybe there were other suspects
Yeah.
that they weren't considering.
Okay, but we know that there was no forced entry.
Right.
And that Mark had a history of making threats toward Lorrie.
Yeah, they tried to downplay that.
Yeah.
They said that the threats were made out of anger during a difficult divorce.
Right.
And that, they weren't serious.
But how do you say that those weren't serious when there's a clear pattern of...
Right. Well, they argued that he was just a heartbroken guy.
Yeah.
Not a killer.
Okay, but was the jury buying this?
I mean, that's the question, right?
Right.
The jury has to weigh all this information and decide,
who's telling the truth.
Yeah. Do they believe Mark or is the evidence strong enough to convict him?
So it's this legal battle, right?
Yeah.
You've got the prosecution saying that he's this jealous husband who snapped.
Right.
And then you've got the defense painting him as this wrongly accused man.
The heartbroken ex.
Right. So was there anything in the courtroom, any testimony that really stuck out?
Oh, yeah. There was Lorrie's best friend.
Okay.
She took the stand.
Yeah.
And she gave this really powerful account of what Lorrie had told her.
About her fears.
Yeah, about her fears, about the threats.
Yeah.
About how Mark was behaving.
And that must have been pretty impactful.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it really personalized everything.
Right.
It wasn't just words on a page anymore.
Right.
This was someone who knew and loved Lorrie.
Yeah.
Sharing what she had been through.
And it really brought to light the whole issue of domestic violence, right?
It did, because a lot of this happens behind closed doors.
Right.
And, often the victims don't feel safe speaking out.
Right.
So having someone like her best friend come forward and share that, it was huge.
So the trial goes on. We have this dramatic testimony.
Yeah.
And now the jury has to make a decision.
Yeah, the weight of the world is on their shoulders.
Right. What was the atmosphere like in the courtroom?
You could cut the tension with a knife.
Yeah.
Everyone was on edge.
Waiting for that.
Lives were hanging in the balance.
Right. And what was the verdict?
Guilty.
Wow.
Guilty of first-degree murder.
So what was the reaction in the courtroom?
I mean, it was a mix of emotions,
Yeah.
Relief, vindication, sadness.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, it was justice for Lorrie.
Right.
But it also brought up a lot of pain,
Yeah. So a bittersweet victory.
Yeah, exactly.
And what was his sentence?
Life in prison.
Wow.
Without the possibility of parole.
So Mark Smith is held accountable for his actions.
Yeah.
And Lorrie's family finally gets some sense of justice.
I mean, as much justice as you can get in a situation like this.
But it's clear that this case is about more than just one crime.
It is. It really highlights the issue of domestic violence.
Right.
And how often it goes unnoticed.
It does.
Yeah,
it's a reminder that these things don't just happen out of nowhere.
Right. They're usually warning signs.
Yeah.
Patterns of behavior.
Right.
And we need to be aware of them.
And we need to be more vigilant.
Yeah, absolutely.
And willing to step in.
And speak up
when we see something wrong.
Right. Exactly.
So the legal battle is over, but the conversation about domestic violence
Continues.
continues.
And Lorrie's story is part of that.
Yeah, it's a catalyst for change.
It is.
And for raising awareness.
Absolutely.
So let's explore that aspect a little bit more.
Okay.
What happened after the verdict? How did Lorrie's story impact the community and the conversation around domestic violence?
Well, that's where things get really inspiring.
Yeah.
Because instead of letting the grief consume them,
Yeah.
Lorrie's family, they channeled it into something positive.
Really, it's incredible.
Yeah.
How did they do that? It's really amazing how they took this horrible situation and turned it into something good.
Yeah, they could have easily just, retreated and grieved in private, but they didn't.
Right.
They really wanted to make sure that Lorrie's death meant something.
Yeah. And how did they go about doing that?
Well, they started a foundation
Okay.
in Lorrie's name to support victims of domestic violence and to promote healthy relationships.
Right.
And they did a lot of, community events,
Yeah.
speaking engagements. They talked to the media.
Yeah.
Anything they could do to raise awareness.
It's about getting people talking, right?
Yeah. Breaking the silence.
Yeah.
Because that's how domestic violence thrives.
Right, in the shadows.
Yeah, in secrecy.
And did their efforts have an impact?
They did. They actually were instrumental in getting a local shelter
Wow.
built for victims of domestic violence.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And they also worked with law enforcement
Okay.
to improve training for officers responding to domestic violence calls.
So they made a real difference.
Yeah, they do. They turned their pain into action.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And they really made their community a safer place.
And they made sure that Lorrie wouldn't be forgotten.
Exactly. Her legacy lives on.
Yeah. And it shows that even in the darkest of times,
Right.
there's still hope.
Absolutely. You can find meaning and purpose.
It also reminds us that, we can't just sit back
Right.
and be bystanders.
We all have a role to play
Yeah, we have to be aware. We have to be willing to speak up
and step in.
when we see something.
Yeah, something doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
Say something.
Exactly. And, sometimes just listening to someone can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Just letting them know
Yeah.
that they're not alone,
Right.
that someone believes them.
And are there resources available for people?
Oh, yeah, there are tons of resources. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is a great place to start.
Okay.
They offer 247 support,
Wow.
and they can connect you with local resources.
That's great.
And there are also shelters,
Right.
support groups, legal aid organizations.
All right. So if you're out there and you're experiencing abuse
Yeah.
or you know someone who is, please reach out.
Don't suffer in silence.
Yeah, you're not alone.
There is help available.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive today.
On the case of Lorrie Anne Smith,
Yeah.
we're left with this mix of emotions.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah. But, Lorrie's story, it's a reminder
It is.
of the terrible consequences of domestic violence. But it's also a reminder of hope.
Yeah. And resilience.
Yeah.
And the power of the human spirit.
Yeah, we explored the investigation, the trial, the verdict,
Yeah.
and the lasting impact of Lorrie's story.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. What do you hope our listeners take away from this?
Well, I hope they understand that domestic violence is something that affects us all.
Yeah.
And that we all have a responsibility to do something about it.
To be aware, to speak up.
Yeah, to support victims.
Yeah.
To educate ourselves.
Right.
To create a world where this doesn't happen anymore.
So Lorrie Anne Smith's legacy lives on
It does.
in the hearts of those who loved her and in the work that continues to be done to prevent these tragedies.
Absolutely.
Her story might be heartbreaking.
But it's also a story of hope and resilience.
It is.
And a reminder that we can all make a difference.
We can.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.